In 2019, a researcher working at the University of Vienna drilled with extreme precision into the petrous bone of a skull unearthed from a necropolis just outside Rome. The petrous bone is the densest structure in the human body, buried deep behind the ear. Because of its density, it preserves DNA far better than any other part of the skeleton, sometimes for thousands of years, even in environments that would erase every other biological trace. From that tiny fragment, a fine powder was extracted, processed, amplified, sequenced, and compared against thousands of genomes, both ancient and modern. When the results came back, they told a story that overturned much of what had long been assumed about who lived in Italy, when they lived there, and where they came from. This is not a story about Romans, or Etruscans, or Lombards in isolation. It is a story of layers, successive waves of people arriving on a peninsula shaped like a boot, extending into the Mediterranean. Each wave partially overwrote the genetic record of the last, leaving behind traces so faint they remained invisible for millennia. 5 major demographic upheavals, spanning 12,000 years, compressed into a genome that can be read from a speck of bone dust. The real question is no longer whether Italians are who they believe themselves to be. It is whether anyone could have predicted what that dust would reveal. To understand the implications of these genetic findings, you have to first understand the consensus that existed before ancient DNA sequencing became possible. For most of the 20th century, the history of Italy was reconstructed through language, artifacts, and written records. Romans spoke Latin, an Indo-European language. The Etruscans spoke something entirely different, still not fully deciphered. Greeks colonized the south, founding cities like Syracuse, Taranto, and Naples. Gauls settled in the north, while later Germanic groups like the Lombards entered after the fall of Rome. None of this was controversial, but beneath it all was a quiet assumption that modern Italians were largely the direct genetic descendants of the ancient Romans, that the biological foundation of the peninsula had been set during antiquity, and everything that followed Lombard invasions, Norman conquests, Arab Emirates was merely cultural layering on top of a stable genetic base. It was a clean narrative. It aligned with archaeology. It felt intuitive, and for a long time, there was no way to test it. Regional differences within Italy were interpreted as echoes of ancient tribal divisions. Northern Italians were linked to Gauls and Lombards, southern Italians to Greeks and indigenous Italic peoples. Sardinians stood apart, isolated on their island. The story held together neatly, but it survived largely because it could not be challenged. Before the mid-2010s, population genetics relied almost entirely on modern DNA. Researchers compared living populations and tried to infer the past from present-day patterns. The problem is that very different historical processes can produce nearly identical modern genetic signatures. A population that remained stable for 3,000 years and one that was replaced multiple times can look strikingly similar if all you examine is the endpoint. Early mitochondrial DNA studies added to the confusion. A 2007 analysis comparing modern Tuscans with populations in Anatolia appeared to confirm the ancient claim that the Etruscans had migrated from Lydia. It was widely accepted, even celebrated. But mitochondrial DNA traces only a single maternal line, one narrow thread of ancestry. It ignores paternal contributions and the vast majority of the genome. Trying to reconstruct population history from it is like trying to understand a city by interviewing one person per household and only asking about their mother's side. The real breakthrough came with whole genome sequencing of ancient DNA extracted specifically from petrous bones. Because of their density, these bones preserve genetic material in conditions that would normally destroy it within centuries. When researchers began systematically applying this technique across Italy, the tidy historical narrative began to collapse. A landmark study published in 2019 analyzed 127 ancient genomes from 29 archaeological sites in and around Rome, covering 12,000 years of continuous habitation. What it revealed was not continuity, but rupture repeated, dramatic shifts in the genetic makeup of the population. The first major transformation occurred around 8,000 years ago. Neolithic farmers from Anatolia and the Near East arrived and largely replaced the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had lived in Italy since the end of the last ice age. These hunter-gatherers had deep roots, stretching back tens of thousands of years. But the spread of agriculture across Europe was not a gradual blending. It was, in many regions, a near total replacement. In Italy, the genetic signature of those original inhabitants was reduced to a minority, roughly 15 to 25% of the genome. One place, however, remained relatively untouched: Sardinia. Isolated and difficult to access, the island largely escaped later migrations. Modern Sardinians remain the closest living population to those early Neolithic farmers, a genetic time capsule surrounded by water. The second major shift came during the Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago. Populations carrying ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian steppe moved into Europe and eventually into Italy. Associated with the bell beaker culture, these groups introduced a new genetic component that spread widely across the continent. By the time Rome was traditionally founded in 753 BCE, Central Italians already carried a significant proportion of this steppe ancestry, around 30%. Two massive population turnovers had already occurred. Then came a result that was genuinely unexpected. A large-scale genetic study focused on the Etruscans, long thought to have origins in Anatolia, found no evidence of recent Anatolian ancestry at all. Genetically, the Etruscans were indistinguishable from their Latin neighbors. Same ancestry components, same proportions, two cultures with radically different languages, beliefs, and customs, and virtually identical DNA. The earlier mitochondrial DNA findings that seemed to confirm an Anatolian origin now appear misleading. A single lineage had been mistaken for the whole story. But even this was not the most disruptive discovery. During the Roman imperial period, beginning in the 1st century CE, the genetic profile of people living in and around Rome underwent one of the most dramatic transformations ever recorded in European history. Ancestry shifted heavily toward the Eastern Mediterranean. Individuals from this period appeared genetically closer to populations from regions like Syria, Lebanon, and Western Anatolia than to earlier Italians. Estimates suggest that roughly half of the ancestry in central Italy during this time came from the Eastern Mediterranean. The mechanism was the empire itself. At its height, Rome governed tens of millions of people across 3 continents. Slaves, merchants, soldiers, and administrators flowed into the capital from across the empire, especially from the more densely populated eastern provinces. This was not a slow trickle. The genetic evidence suggests a rapid transformation within just a few generations. Rome did not simply conquer the East moved into Rome. And then, after the empire collapsed, the process continued. Germanic groups, particularly the Lombards, entered Italy beginning in the 6th century CE. Genetic evidence confirms that this was not just a military takeover, it involved entire communities migrating, families included. Their influence was uneven. Northern and central Italy absorbed more of this northern European ancestry, while southern regions, many of which remained under Byzantine control, retained stronger ties to the Eastern Mediterranean. Southern Italy also carries the legacy of earlier Greek colonization. Beginning in the 8th century BCE, Greek settlers established extensive communities across the south and Sicily. These were not minor outposts but full-scale cities that integrated with local populations over centuries. Modern genetic studies reflect this layered history. Italy today shows one of the highest levels of genetic regional variation in Europe. Northern Italians tend to cluster with populations from Spain and southern France. Southern Italians are closer to Greeks. Sardinians remain distinct from both. Some researchers still argue for continuity, that the core genetic structure of Italy was established in the Bronze Age and only modified at the margins afterward. But the data makes that position increasingly difficult to sustain. A 50% ancestry shift during the Roman period is not a marginal adjustment. It is a transformation. What emerges instead is a more complex and less comfortable truth. Genetic ancestry does not map neatly onto cultural identity. Languages can persist, even as populations change. Cultures can diverge, even when genetics remain the same. The deeper story of Italy is not one of stability, but of constant movement. Stand in Rome today, and beneath your feet lies 12,000 years of human turnover. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, steppe migrants, Greek colonists, Roman citizens, Eastern Mediterranean newcomers, Germanic settlers, each layer still present, still detectable. And the technology that allows us to see this, to read entire histories from fragments of bone, has existed for barely a decade. The next sample could change everything again. At this point, that is not speculation. It is the pattern.